HOA built 35 homes on my land, so I opened the dam and watched it flow. Marcus Blackwood stood at the edge of his property, watching the construction crews work below in the valley. For 30 years, he had owned this land, all 2,000 acres of it, including the mineral rights, water rights, and everything in between. The rolling hills stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with ancient oak trees, and crossed by a crystal-clear stream that flowed from the dam he had built in the mountains above. He had inherited the land from his grandfather, who had inherited it from his father before him. The Blackwood family had been stewards of this wilderness for over a century. Marcus had built his modest cabin on the highest point of the property, where he could watch over everything like a sentinel. He lived simply off the grid, with solar panels and a wind turbine providing his power and the stream providing fresh water. The peace of his sanctuary was being shattered by the sound of heavy machinery. A month ago, developers had arrived claiming they had purchased land for a new residential development called Meadowbrook Estates. They had shown him documents and surveys that made no sense to Marcus. According to their paperwork, they owned a significant portion of what he knew to be his land. Marcus had tried to reason with them, showing his own deeds and surveys, but the development company, Pinnacle Properties, had brushed him off. They claimed there had been some sort of clerical error decades ago, and that the county had mistakenly issued him a deed for land that belonged to them. They assured him their lawyers would sort it all out, but in the meantime, construction would continue. The first house had gone up 3 weeks ago, then 5 more. Now there were 35 completed homes scattered across the valley floor, each one a monument to corporate arrogance. The houses were identical cookie-cutter structures with beige siding and brown roofs. They looked like a plague upon the landscape, destroying the natural beauty that had existed for generations. Marcus had spent the last month fighting the development through proper legal channels. He had hired the best lawyer he could afford and filed injunctions and restraining orders. But Pinnacle Properties had deeper pockets and better connected attorneys. Every legal motion Marcus filed was countered with 3 more from Pinnacle. The court system moved slowly while the construction crews worked fast. The most infuriating part was the homeowners association that Pinnacle had established. The HOA had been formed even before the first residents moved in, with a board of directors handpicked by the development company. They had immediately begun issuing citations and fines to Marcus for various supposed violations of covenants he had never agreed to. According to the HOA, his cabin was an eyesore that decreased property values. His solar panels and wind turbine were unsightly. His refusal to maintain a manicured lawn was a violation of community standards. They had sent him official-looking documents demanding he pay thousands of dollars in fines or face legal action. Marcus crumpled up another HOA citation that had arrived in his mailbox that morning. This one was for allowing native wildflowers to grow instead of planting approved landscaping. The audacity was breathtaking. They had built 35 houses on his land without permission, and now they were fining him for not conforming to their arbitrary rules. He walked back toward his cabin, passing the old stone dam his grandfather had built in the 1960s. The dam created a small lake in the mountains that fed the stream running through the valley below. It had been built to provide water for cattle ranching and irrigation, but Marcus had maintained it over the years as both a backup water source and a piece of family history. The dam was solid fieldstone construction with a spillway that could handle significant water flow. His grandfather had been an engineer and had overbuilt the structure to last for generations. During heavy spring melts or major storms, the spillway would open automatically to prevent the dam from being damaged by excess pressure. Marcus stopped at the dam control house, a small concrete building that housed the manual controls for the spillway. Inside were wheels and levers that could open the gates to release water from the lake above. The system was entirely mechanical requiring no electricity to operate. His grandfather had designed it that way, believing that critical infrastructure should not depend on power that could fail. Standing there, looking down at the construction site, Marcus felt a moment of clarity. He had tried to fight Pinnacle Properties through the legal system, but they had more money and better lawyers. He had tried to reason with the HOA, but they refused to acknowledge that he owned the land they were living on. Traditional methods were failing him, but Marcus had one advantage that neither Pinnacle Properties nor the HOA had considered. He controlled the water that flowed through their development. The stream that ran past all 35 houses originated from his dam. Without that water flow, the beautiful creek that marketing materials had called a prime selling point would become a dry, rocky channel. More importantly, the homes in Meadowbrook Estates had been built in what was technically a floodplain. The developers had graded the land and installed drainage systems, but those systems were designed to handle normal seasonal water flow, not the full capacity of the dam. If someone were to open the spillway completely, the resulting flood would be substantial. Marcus spent the evening researching flood patterns and water flow calculations. He pulled out old engineering documents his grandfather had left behind, along with topographical maps and soil surveys. The more he studied, the more he understood the scope of what was possible. The lake behind the dam held approximately 50 million gallons of water. Under normal circumstances, only a small portion of that water flowed downstream through the spillway. But if the gates were opened fully, the entire volume could be released over the course of several hours. The narrow valley below would channel that water directly through the Meadowbrook Estates development. According to the original surveys, the valley had experienced major floods several times in the past century before the dam was built. The highest recorded flood level was marked on trees that were still standing today. That flood level was approximately 3 feet higher than the foundation level of the houses Pinnacle Properties had built. Marcus realized his grandfather had been incredibly wise to build the dam where he did. Not only did it provide water storage and flood control, but it gave whoever controlled it tremendous power over everything downstream. The old man had essentially built a switch that could turn the stream into a raging river at will. The next morning, Marcus received another legal document from Pinnacle Properties. Their lawyers were now claiming that his refusal to vacate the disputed land constituted criminal trespass. They were threatening to have him arrested if he did not abandon his own property within 30 days. That same afternoon, a new HOA citation arrived. This one was for operating unlicensed electrical generation equipment, namely his solar panels and wind turbine. The fine was $10,000 with additional penalties accruing daily until the equipment was removed. Marcus sat on his porch reading these documents and feeling his anger build. These people had stolen his land, built houses on it without permission, and now they were threatening to have him arrested for living in his own home. The legal system that should have protected his property rights was instead being weaponized against him by wealthy developers with expensive lawyers. He walked down to examine the new houses more closely. Each one was nearly identical, with the same floor plan and exterior design. They were cheaply built with vinyl siding and composition shingles. The landscaping was minimal, just enough grass and shrubs to meet HOA requirements. These were not homes built with love or craftsmanship, but products mass-produced for maximum profit. The streets had been paved with asphalt and lined with concrete curbs and storm drains. Street lights had been installed along with fire hydrants and mailbox clusters. The development looked like it had been stamped out by a machine with no consideration for the natural contours of the land or the existing ecosystem. Marcus noticed that several of the houses already had families living in them. Children played in the small yards while parents worked in gardens or washed cars in driveways. These were real people who had purchased homes in good faith, believing they were buying legitimate property in a legal development. The thought gave him pause. If he opened the dam, these innocent families would bear the consequences of Pinnacle Properties' corruption. Their homes would be damaged or destroyed through no fault of their own. They were victims of the same fraud that was being perpetrated against Marcus himself. But as he watched the scene below, Marcus noticed something else. The new residents were not just innocent bystanders, they were active participants in the HOA system that was harassing him. Several of them served on the board of directors that had been issuing citations and fines. They had voted to approve the covenant violations against his property. One of the residents, a man named Robert, who lived in house number 12, had personally delivered several HOA notices to Marcus. Robert worked as an accountant and took his role as HOA treasurer very seriously. He had calculated the exact fines and penalties being assessed against Marcus' property and had threatened legal action if payment was not received promptly. Another resident named Patricia, who lived in house number 7, had been elected as HOA secretary. She was responsible for sending out the official notices and maintaining records of covenant violations. Patricia had gone so far as to photograph Marcus' property from multiple angles to document supposed infractions. The HOA president was a retired military officer named Colonel James Thompson, who lived in house number 1, the largest lot in the development. Thompson had moved in just 2 weeks ago, but had immediately begun treating the development like his personal command. He had instituted daily inspections of common areas and had proposed hiring security guards to patrol the neighborhood. Thompson had sent Marcus a letter demanding that he attend the next HOA meeting to address his multiple violations. The letter was written in military style with precise language and formal structure. Thompson had made it clear that he considered Marcus' refusal to comply with HOA rules to be insubordination that would not be tolerated. Marcus found himself caught between sympathy for the innocent residents and anger at those who were actively participating in his harassment. The situation was more complex than simple revenge against a faceless corporation. Real people lived in those houses now, and any action he took would affect their lives. That evening, Marcus received a phone call from his lawyer. The news was not good. Pinnacle Properties had filed a new lawsuit claiming that Marcus was interfering with their construction project and causing financial damages. They were seeking not only his removal from the property, but also monetary compensation for delays and lost profits. The lawyer explained that Pinnacle had hired a team of experts to challenge every aspect of Marcus' land ownership. They had found minor discrepancies in surveys from the 1800s and were using those to argue that the original land grants were invalid. They had brought in historians and genealogists to research the Blackwood family claims going back generations. Most concerning was Pinnacle's claim that the dam Marcus controlled was actually built on their property, not his. According to their latest survey, the dam structure itself was located just across the boundary line on land they claimed to own. If this claim held up in court, Marcus would lose not only his home, but also his control over the water supply. The legal battle was becoming a war of attrition. Pinnacle Properties had unlimited resources and could afford to file motion after motion while Marcus' legal bills mounted. His lawyer estimated that fighting the case through to completion would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars with no guarantee of success. Marcus hung up the phone and sat in silence. The system was rigged against individual property owners who lacked the resources to fight major corporations. Justice was available only to those who could afford to purchase it from expensive law firms. His grandfather and great-grandfather had worked their entire lives to build something that could be preserved for future generations, but it was being stolen through legal technicalities and procedural manipulation. He walked outside and looked up at the stars. The night sky was clear and bright without light pollution from nearby cities. This was one of the things he loved most about his property, the ability to see the universe as his ancestors had seen it. Soon that view would be obscured by street lights and house lights from the development below. The sound of the stream flowing past his cabin was soothing and constant. That water had been flowing for thousands of years, carving the valley and nourishing the ecosystem. His family had been stewards of that water for 4 generations, protecting it from pollution and overuse. Now it was being treated as just another commodity to be exploited for profit. Marcus made his decision that night. The legal system had failed him. The political system had failed him. Corporate power had triumphed over individual rights, and property law had been perverted to serve the wealthy. If traditional methods of justice were not available, then he would have to create his own justice. The next morning, he walked up to the dam and spent several hours inspecting the spillway mechanism. The manual controls were in perfect working order, maintained regularly over the decades. The gates could be opened gradually to increase water flow, or opened completely for maximum discharge. The system was designed to be operated by a single person using simple mechanical advantage. Marcus tested the controls to make sure everything functioned properly. The wheel turned smoothly, and the gates responded immediately to adjustments. He calculated that it would take approximately 6 hours to completely drain the lake if the spillway was open to full capacity. The peak flow rate would occur about 2 hours after opening, when the pressure differential was greatest. He also examined the downstream channel to predict how the floodwater would behave. The stream bed was rocky and well-defined with natural barriers that would direct flow toward the development. The houses had been built on flat ground that would not provide natural drainage for large volumes of water. The result would be widespread flooding throughout Meadowbrook Estates. Marcus spent the afternoon preparing his cabin for what was to come. He moved important documents and family photos to higher ground and secured anything that might be damaged by flooding. He also prepared a detailed written account of everything that had happened, including copies of all legal documents and HOA citations. This written record would explain his actions to anyone who came looking for answers later. Marcus wanted the world to understand that he had not acted capriciously or maliciously, but had been driven to desperate measures by systematic legal and financial abuse. He was not a criminal, but a property owner defending his rights when all other options had been exhausted. As evening approached, Marcus walked through his property one final time. He said good-bye to the old oak trees and the wildflower meadows. He apologized to the wildlife that would be displaced by what was about to happen. This land had been his responsibility for 30 years, and he felt the weight of that stewardship, even as he prepared to unleash forces that would change everything forever. The sun was setting behind the mountains when Marcus reached the dam control house. He looked down at the 35 houses scattered across the valley floor, with their lights beginning to come on as darkness fell. Families were sitting down to dinner completely unaware of what was about to happen. Children were doing homework while parents watched television or worked in home offices. Marcus thought about each of those families and what they would lose. He thought about Robert the accountant who had calculated his fines with such precision. He thought about Patricia the secretary who had documented his supposed violations so thoroughly. He thought about Colonel Thompson, who had tried to treat him like an insubordinate soldier. But he also thought about his grandfather, who had worked his entire life to build something lasting. He thought about his great-grandfather, who had fought to establish the original land claim. He thought about generations of Blackwood family members who had protected this land and passed it down intact. Their sacrifice and dedication deserved better than to be stolen through corporate fraud and legal manipulation. Marcus placed his hand on the spillway control wheel and began to turn it slowly. The mechanism responded smoothly as water began to flow more rapidly through the spillway. He could hear the sound of increased flow echoing through the valley below. The stream that had been a gentle creek for decades was about to become something much more powerful. He continued turning the wheel, opening the spillway gates wider and wider. The sound of rushing water grew louder as millions of gallons began their journey downstream toward Meadowbrook Estates. Marcus watched the water level in the lake behind the dam begin to drop as the spillway discharged its contents into the valley below. Within an hour, the increased water flow reached the first houses in the development. The stream that had been 6 inches deep and 3 feet wide suddenly became 2 feet deep and 12 feet wide. Water began spilling over the banks and flowing across the carefully manicured lawns of Meadowbrook Estates. Marcus walked back to his cabin and sat on the porch to watch what would unfold. From his elevated position, he could see the entire development spread out below him. The street lights illuminated the growing pools of water as the flood reached each successive house. It was both terrible and magnificent to witness the power of nature reclaiming land that had been stolen from its natural state. The first residents to notice the flooding came outside to investigate the strange sounds they were hearing. They stood in their driveways, pointing at the rising water and talking to neighbors over fence lines. Some of them began moving cars to higher ground or bringing patio furniture up onto decks and porches. As the water continued to rise, the mood in the development shifted from curiosity to concern. Residents began making phone calls, presumably to emergency services and insurance companies. Marcus could see people moving belongings from basements and lower floors to upper levels of their homes. By midnight, the flooding was extensive throughout Meadowbrook Estates. Every house had water surrounding it with depths ranging from a few inches to several feet depending on elevation. The streets had become rivers with storm drains overwhelmed by the volume of water flowing through the development. Marcus continued to monitor the situation throughout the night. He had positioned battery-powered radios to listen to emergency communications and news reports. The initial response was confusion, as authorities tried to understand what was causing the unprecedented flooding. Weather reports showed no storms or unusual precipitation that would explain the sudden rise in water levels. Emergency responders had evacuated several families whose homes were in the deepest areas of flooding. Fire trucks and ambulances lined the main road leading into Meadowbrook Estates, while rescue boats ferried residents and belongings to safety. The scene looked like the aftermath of a major natural disaster. As dawn broke, Marcus could see the full extent of what he had unleashed. The 35 houses of Meadowbrook Estates were now islands surrounded by a temporary lake. The water was not deep enough to completely submerge the structures, but it was certainly deep enough to cause extensive damage to foundations, electrical systems, and anything stored at ground level. The perfectly manicured lawns were now underwater along with sidewalks, driveways, and landscaping. Cars that had not been moved to higher ground sat partially submerged in the driveways. The community playground and mailbox clusters were completely underwater, creating an apocalyptic scene of suburban infrastructure overwhelmed by natural forces. Marcus felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness as he watched the sunrise illuminate the flooded development. Justice had been served in the most direct way possible, but it had come at a tremendous cost to innocent people who had been caught in the crossfire between him and Pinnacle Properties. The sound of helicopters drew his attention skyward. News crews were beginning to arrive to document the disaster. Soon the story would spread beyond the immediate area, and the whole world would learn about the mysterious flooding that had destroyed an entire housing development overnight. Marcus knew that investigators would eventually trace the flood back to his dam, and that criminal charges were likely to follow. He had prepared himself for that possibility and had already contacted a different lawyer who specialized in defending people who had taken extreme measures to protect their property rights. The phone in his cabin began ringing shortly after sunrise. Marcus ignored it, knowing that it was probably reporters or authorities trying to reach him. He had said everything he wanted to say in the written statement he had prepared. His actions spoke louder than any words could. By mid-morning, the evacuation of Meadowbrook Estates was complete. Emergency responders had confirmed that no one had been seriously injured, though several residents had been treated for minor cuts and bruises sustained while evacuating in the dark. The human cost had been minimized, but the property damage was extensive. Marcus watched as investigators began arriving at the scene. He could see them examining the flooded houses and taking photographs for insurance and legal purposes. Teams of experts were measuring water levels and collecting samples to determine the source and composition of the flood water. It would not take them long to trace the water upstream to his dam. The connection was obvious to anyone who understood the local geography and hydrology. Marcus had made no effort to conceal his involvement because he wanted the world to know that this was not a random act of nature, but a deliberate response to systematic injustice. Around noon, a convoy of official vehicles made its way up the mountain road toward Marcus' cabin. He could see sheriff deputies, environmental investigators, and what appeared to be federal agents. The legal reckoning he had been expecting was about to begin. Marcus put on his best clothes and gathered the documents he had prepared. He took one last look around his cabin at the home his grandfather had built and that he had maintained for 3 decades. Whatever happened next, he had lived his entire adult life in this place and had been shaped by its peace and beauty. First knock on his door came at exactly 12:30 in the afternoon. Marcus opened it to find Sheriff Deputy Williams, a man he had known for years, standing with several other officials. Williams looked uncomfortable with the situation, but was clearly there to do his job. Behind Williams stood a woman who introduced herself as Agent Rebecca Torres from the Environmental Protection Agency. She was accompanied by investigators from the State Water Authority and representatives from the District Attorney Office. The group was professional, but serious, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. Marcus invited them inside and offered coffee, which most of them accepted. He had decided to be completely cooperative with the investigation because he had nothing to hide and everything to explain. His actions had been deliberate and calculated, not the result of mental illness or temporary insanity. Agent Torres began the questioning by asking Marcus if he understood why they were there. He confirmed that he was aware of the flooding in Meadowbrook Estates and that he had been responsible for opening the dam spillway that caused it. He provided them with copies of his written statement explaining his motives and the circumstances that had led to his decision. The investigators spent several hours interviewing Marcus and examining his documentation. They reviewed the legal battles with Pinnacle Properties, the harassment from the HOA, and the failure of traditional legal remedies to protect his property rights. They also inspected the dam and spillway mechanism to understand exactly how the flooding had been accomplished. Marcus was forthright about every aspect of his actions. He explained how he had calculated the water flow and predicted the extent of flooding. He acknowledged that he had known the flooding would damage the houses in Meadowbrook Estates, but emphasized that he had timed the release to minimize risk to human life. The investigators asked about his mental state and whether he had considered alternatives to flooding the development. Marcus explained that he had spent months trying to resolve the situation through legal channels and had only resorted to extreme measures when all other options had been exhausted. He also provided documentation showing the financial resources that Pinnacle Properties had used to overwhelm him in court. The legal bills he had accumulated were already substantial and would have bankrupted him long before the case could be resolved. The system had been rigged against him from the beginning. As the afternoon wore on, more officials arrived at the scene. Representatives from insurance companies came to assess the damage and investigate potential fraud. Engineers arrived to examine the dam structure and determine whether it posed ongoing risks. Media crews set up outside the property boundaries, hoping to interview Marcus or officials involved in the investigation. The story was already spreading through social media and news outlets. Videos shot by residents during the evacuation showed the dramatic flooding and the panic it had caused. Aerial footage from helicopters revealed the full extent of the damage, with 35 houses sitting in several feet of water. Public reaction was mixed, with some people expressing sympathy for Marcus' situation, while others condemned his actions as terrorism or vigilante justice. Online discussions revealed deep divisions about property rights, corporate power, and the failure of legal institutions to protect individual citizens. Environmental groups pointed out that the houses had been built in a natural floodplain, and that the flooding demonstrated the folly of development in inappropriate locations. They argued that Marcus had inadvertently provided a valuable lesson about respecting natural water systems and not building in areas prone to flooding. Property rights advocates rallied to Marcus' defense, arguing that he had been driven to desperate measures by systematic abuse of the legal system. They pointed out that Pinnacle Properties had essentially stolen his land through procedural manipulation, and that traditional legal remedies had been ineffective. Critics argued that nothing justified endangering the lives and property of innocent families who had purchased homes in good faith. They maintained that Marcus should have continued fighting through the courts, regardless of the cost or time involved, rather than taking matters into his own hands. Legal experts debated the complex issues raised by the case. Some argued that Marcus' actions constituted criminal destruction of property and possibly domestic terrorism. Others suggested that he had acted within his rights as the legitimate owner of the dam and the water it controlled. The technical legality of opening the spillway was particularly complex. Marcus clearly had the right to control water flow from his own dam, but using that control to intentionally damage other property raised questions about the limits of property rights. The case would likely establish important precedents for similar situations in the future. By evening, the immediate investigation at Marcus' property was complete. The officials had gathered all the evidence they needed and had taken his full statement about the incident. Agent Torres informed him that criminal charges were likely to be filed, but that the specific charges would depend on further investigation and consultation with prosecutors. Marcus was not arrested that day, but was advised not to leave the area while the investigation continued. The dam spillway was sealed by court order to prevent any further flooding, while engineers assessed the safety of the structure and the extent of environmental damage. The media attention intensified as the story gained national coverage. News crews from major networks arrived to report on what they were calling the Great Dam Revenge. Marcus found himself portrayed as everything from a folk hero, standing up to corporate bullies, to a dangerous extremist who had taken the law into his own hands. Interview requests poured in from television shows, newspapers, and magazines. Publishers offered book deals, and movie producers expressed interest in the story. Marcus declined all media requests, preferring to let his written statement speak for itself, rather than becoming a public spectacle. The residents of Meadowbrook Estates faced a long and difficult recovery process. Insurance companies initially balked at covering flood damage, arguing that the flooding was caused by an intentional criminal act rather than a natural disaster. Legal battles over coverage would likely continue for months or years. Many families had lost everything they owned in the flooding. Furniture, electronics, appliances, and personal belongings had been ruined by the water. Even items that survived the flood often had to be discarded due to contamination concerns. The financial and emotional toll on the residents was enormous. Some families decided to abandon their homes entirely rather than attempt repairs. The foundation damage alone would cost tens of thousands of dollars per house, and there was no guarantee that similar flooding could not happen again. The development that had been marketed as a prime residential location was now seen as a disaster area. Pinnacle Properties found itself facing multiple lawsuits from residents seeking compensation for their losses. The company attempted to shift blame to Marcus, arguing that his criminal actions were the sole cause of the damage. However, their legal position was complicated by the ongoing disputes over land ownership and the legitimacy of the original development. The HOA that had been so aggressive in pursuing violations against Marcus property was now focused on coordinating disaster relief for its members. The same board members who had calculated fines and documented infractions were now calculating repair costs and documenting flood damage. Colonel Thompson, who had threatened Marcus with military discipline over HOA violations, found his own house among the most severely damaged. The retired officer had to be evacuated by boat and lost most of his possessions to the flood. His plans for neighborhood security patrols were replaced by discussions of flood insurance and disaster recovery. Robert, the accountant who had precisely calculated Marcus' fines, was now precisely calculating the cost of replacing his flooded basement office and water-damaged financial records. The man who had threatened legal action over unpaid HOA dues was now facing his own legal battles with insurance companies. Patricia, the HOA secretary who had documented every supposed violation of Marcus property, was now documenting water damage to her own home for insurance purposes. The photographs she had taken to prove covenant violations were nothing compared to the dramatic images of her house surrounded by flood water. The irony was not lost on Marcus as he watched these developments unfold. The same people who had used bureaucratic harassment against him were now experiencing their own bureaucratic nightmares with insurance companies, emergency services, and disaster relief agencies. Meanwhile, the legal case against Pinnacle Properties for the original land dispute took on new dimensions. The flooding had drawn attention to questions about whether the development should have been built in that location at all. Environmental impact studies that had been glossed over during the original approval process were now being scrutinized carefully. Engineers examining the flood damage confirmed that the houses had indeed been built in a natural floodplain. The stream that Marcus controlled had historically flooded the valley during periods of high water flow. Pinnacle Properties had ignored this history when designing and marketing Meadowbrook Estates. The revelation that the houses were built in a floodplain raised questions about the original permits and approvals for the development. Local planning officials found themselves under investigation for potentially approving construction in areas that should have been protected from development. Marcus' legal team seized on these developments to argue that their client had actually performed a public service by demonstrating the dangers of inappropriate development in flood-prone areas. They suggested that the flooding was a predictable and necessary consequence of building houses where they should never have been built. Public opinion began to shift somewhat in Marcus' favor as more details emerged about the questionable practices of Pinnacle Properties. Investigative journalists discovered that the company had a history of problematic developments, and had been accused of similar land disputes in other states. The story became a symbol of broader issues about corporate power, environmental protection, and property rights. Marcus found himself reluctantly thrust into the role of folk hero for people who felt powerless against large corporations and unresponsive legal systems. Environmental activists held rallies supporting Marcus' actions and calling for stronger protections against development in sensitive areas. Property rights groups organized legal defense funds to help with his mounting legal bills. The case became a cause célèbre for various political movements. However, Marcus remained focused on the immediate consequences of his actions rather than the broader political implications. He spent his days dealing with investigators, attorneys, and reporters while trying to maintain some semblance of normal life in his cabin. The dam remained sealed by court order, while engineers conducted safety inspections and environmental assessments. The lake behind the dam was slowly refilling, but water flow downstream had been reduced to minimal levels. The stream through Meadowbrook Estates was back to its normal size, though much of the development remained uninhabitable. Weeks passed as the investigation continued, and legal proceedings began. Marcus was eventually charged with multiple felonies, including destruction of property, reckless endangerment, and environmental crimes. The charges carried potential sentences totaling decades in prison. His legal team mounted a vigorous defense arguing that Marcus had acted within his rights as a property owner, and that the real criminals were the corporations and officials who had enabled theft of his land. They presented evidence of the systematic legal abuse Marcus had suffered and the failure of traditional remedies to address the injustice. The trial became a media sensation with coverage that extended far beyond the local community. Legal experts debated the complex questions of property law, environmental regulation, and the limits of individual action against corporate power. The case was seen as a test of whether ordinary citizens had any recourse against well-funded corporations. Marcus' testimony was compelling as he described his family history with the land and his decades of stewardship over the property. He spoke eloquently about the failure of legal institutions to protect his rights and the desperation that had driven him to take extreme measures. The prosecution argued that regardless of Marcus' grievances, nothing justified endangering lives and destroying property. They emphasized the trauma suffered by the families in Meadowbrook Estates and the millions of dollars in damage caused by the flooding. However, the defense was able to demonstrate that Pinnacle Properties had indeed engaged in fraudulent practices to acquire Marcus land. Expert witnesses testified that the original surveys and land grants clearly established the Blackwood family ownership of the disputed property. The revelation that the development had been built on land that legitimately belonged to Marcus created a sensation in the courtroom and the media. Public opinion swung strongly in his favor as people realized that he had not acted maliciously, but had defended his own property against theft. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a verdict that shocked legal observers. They found Marcus guilty of property destruction, but acquitted him of the more serious charges of reckless endangerment and environmental crimes. The verdict suggested that they understood his motives while still holding him accountable for the damage he had caused. The judge sentenced Marcus to community service and restitution rather than prison time, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances that had led to his actions. The sentence was seen as a victory for Marcus and his supporters, who had argued that he was more victim than perpetrator. Pinnacle Properties faced their own legal reckoning as investigations revealed the full extent of their fraudulent land acquisition practices. The company was forced to pay massive settlements to both Marcus and the residents of Meadowbrook Estates. Several executives were criminally charged with fraud and conspiracy. The HOA that had harassed Marcus with citations and fines was dissolved as the development was abandoned by most residents. The houses that survived the flood were eventually purchased by Marcus as part of the legal settlement, and were demolished to restore the land to its natural state. Years later, Marcus remained in his cabin on the mountain, overlooking the valley that had once been Meadowbrook Estates. The stream flowed freely through the restored landscape, supporting wildlife and maintaining the natural ecosystem his family had protected for generations. The dam still stood as a monument to his grandfather's engineering skills and his own determination to protect what was rightfully his. The spillway had been repaired and upgraded, but remained under Marcus' control, as the court had ultimately confirmed his ownership of both the dam and the surrounding watershed. The story of the Great Dam Revenge became legend in the region, and beyond inspiring other property owners who faced similar battles against corporate encroachment, Marcus became a reluctant symbol of individual resistance against institutional power, though he preferred to think of himself simply as a man who had defended his home. The valley was peaceful again, with wildflowers blooming where houses had once stood, and wildlife returning to habitat that had been temporarily disrupted. The stream ran clear and clean, supporting fish and providing water for the animals that called the wilderness home. Marcus often walked down to where the development had been built, imagining what his grandfather would have thought about the strange turn of events. The old man had built the dam to control floodwaters, not knowing that someday his grandson would use it to create one. But Marcus believed his grandfather would have understood the necessity of defending family land against those who would steal it through legal manipulation. The legal precedents established by the case continued to influence property rights litigation across the country. Courts became more skeptical of corporate claims against individual landowners and more willing to consider the history and legitimacy of land acquisitions. Environmental protections were strengthened as regulators became more careful about approving development in flood-prone areas. The dramatic flooding of Meadowbrook Estates served as a powerful reminder of why certain areas should remain undeveloped regardless of profit potential. Marcus lived quietly in his cabin for the rest of his days, tending to his land and maintaining the dam his grandfather had built. He never married or had children, but he ensured that the property would be preserved as a nature sanctuary after his death, protecting it from future development forever. This story became part of local folklore, told and retold with various embellishments and interpretations. Some versions portrayed Marcus as a heroic defender of property rights, while others depicted him as a dangerous extremist who had taken the law into his own hands. But those who knew the real story understood that Marcus had been neither hero nor villain, but simply a man who had been pushed too far by a system that favored wealth and power over justice. Individual rights. He had used the tools available to him to defend what was rightfully his, and had accepted the consequences of his actions without complaint or regret. The dam still stands today, a testament to one family determination to protect their legacy and their land. This spillway remains functional, though it has never again been used for anything other than routine water management. The valley below is green and wild, as it was meant to be, with a clear stream running through it toward distant mountains. Visitors sometimes hike up to see the famous dam and the cabin where Marcus Blackwood lived and made his stand against corporate power. The site has become a pilgrimage destination for those who believe in the fundamental right of individuals to defend their property against those who would take it through fraud and legal manipulation. The story reminds us that sometimes when all legal remedies have been exhausted and all traditional channels of justice have failed, ordinary people may be forced to take extraordinary measures to protect what is rightfully theirs. It serves as both inspiration and warning about the power of individual action when institutional systems fail to provide justice. Marcus Blackwood opened a dam and watched 35 houses flood, not out of malice or revenge, but out of a deep conviction that some